This is John Cretan with Robert Shiel and Mary Jane DeLorenzo on May 5th, 2021 at 7:12 p.m. This started. So with you, Mrs. DeLorenzo, what are some of the things that you remember from being a kid when you're growing up?
Like from school or any specific thing? Like
Maybe what's like a extra or like outside of school activity that you did?
Yeah, it's just thinking like the movies and things were very important. And we had all these theaters. One was only 5 cents. The other movie was 10 cents. And the other, the real good movies that had actual stage shows were 50 cents, the Chicago Theater. That was, but we can never afford to go there, but that was downtown Chicago.
Do you remember any of the movies that you saw or no?
Well, we saw Gone with the Wind. I think that was in the 40s. And To Kill a Mockingbird was the 50s. That was sort of some of our favorites. But pretty good.
And then, do you remember what was your middle school like?
Okay, I'll tell you about our school. It was kind of special. It was St. Margaret Mary's, and it was just 1st through 8th. We didn't have middle schools or anything like that. And tuition was actually $1 a month. But I had 2 brothers, and my dad had died, and we were pretty poor. So we couldn't afford to pay the $1 a month. But the principal decided to just charge us 50 cents. So it was pretty different from modern school, that's for sure.
Being interviewed by Jack right now.
And one exciting thing that happened once,
She's not home yet.
I think it was about 5th grade, and all of a sudden I had spots on my face, and these other 2 boys had spots, and the teacher said, "Oh, you have to go home right away." And of course, we didn't have telephones or anything. So we just took off and went to the boys' house and played cards and had lots of fun. And that was the extent of our measles. Quite different from these days. Right.
Did anyone else in your family get it, or
No.
just ended up
And
being you?
there's 2 different kinds of measles anyway. One is real short, like the 3-day measles. That's why they probably said we could just go home, but it was really a fun day. You always remember that. But, let's see. Oh, and another thing about the school, our pastor had gone, I don't know if he was hunting, and where are the bears? Where do you have bears? Africa, whatever. Anyway, he caught a bear and he brought him home, and they built a big addition on our school in brick to keep this bear. So at lunchtime, we'd all go out. His name was Jip, G-Y-P, and throw him candy. And he didn't roar much though, but it was pretty exciting to have our own bear, I think.
It was very cool. So it was just like hanging out.
Right. He was there for a long time. I mean, for quite a few years. So it was most unusual. I don't think you would ever hear that these days.
Yeah. But,
No.
so then, what was your high school like? So you went to boarding school for?
I did, yes. It was very fun in Davenport, Iowa. And we could go downtown and do all sorts of things there, and you met some really good friends there. That's what's good. I still have my high school friends, and this was good. I did get a let's see what happened. I'm trying to think.
Show them how you came to be it.
Oh, well, because my dad had died and my mom had died, so I was living with the aunts, and they just heard about the school that was so good. So, and I got a scholarship when I left, so that was pretty good.
Yeah.
And they had good music teachers there. Oh, one kind of unusual thing was for basketball. I was on the team, but the girls you couldn't, I was not the offense, I was the defense, and you couldn't cross the center line. The defense had to stay in the same spot all the time. You never got to shoot for baskets or anything, but it's really different. I don't know when they changed the rules, but it's lucky they did.
I would jump in, even when I was a kid, they still had those rules for girls in basketball, where they couldn't cross the center line. There were offensive players and defensive players. They had to pass it from one side of the court to the other. That's what the girls had to do when I was in grade school. Yeah.
So was your boarding school boys and girls, or was it
Just girls, yeah.
just girls?
We had about 75 students, right?
Not very big.
Yeah, right, that lived there. It was very fun. But we had to walk downtown to go to the swimming pool. That was pretty bad. It was the most embarrassing part of the whole thing, when walking back, all wet. But it's at the top of a hill. You know how Davenport is. It was right on the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of other things would you do in Davenport, like when you guys walk downtown?
We had a tennis court there, so we went to play tennis. We found some good ice cream places. That was good. Can't think what else we did. If we were especially good, one teacher would send us downtown, because you couldn't just go downtown on your own. So that was always fun, to get out and do stuff. Right. And then we'd have dances with the local high school, St. Ambrose High School. It's kind of neat.
The boys' school.
Mhm. Right. And they had a good football team. That was good. Go to all the games.
Do you remember any of those dances? Like what any of them were like? Or
Dances, well, when we had dances at the school, you had to dance with girls, you know, so that was good, right. But we were jitterbuggers. Jitterbug was the best thing. And like in those days, everybody did dance a lot. I don't think people go to dances so much anymore. It was big, right. And we liked all the bands and stuff.
what kinds of bands?
Well, we didn't have a
Okay.
band there. I just meant
Oh.
like
Oh,
big Frank Sinatra fan.
French.
That was the big thing. And then we would play cards. It was fun. But they made you play bridge, which now I like. But so then as soon as the person would disappear, we'd all switch back to some game that we liked. Kind of tricky.
Is that where you learned bridge?
Well, kind of. We would get out of the bridge thing right away, because you have other games like better. Right. See,
Is that where you learned piano?
no, it was pretty good, man. How I learned piano was kind of neat. I got a little toy piano when I was little, and just loved it so much. We didn't have any money, right? But then my mom heard of somebody was giving away a piano. This was in about 3rd grade. So, but the trouble with that was it was $15 to move the piano. We didn't have $15, but I had a very nice, my mom's cousin came up with $15 to move in the piano. So I just really taught myself to play piano. It's really kind of neat. So, and then I became a piano teacher. So it was pretty good. Neat.
And then after, so then going back to high school, after high school, you went to nursing school.
Right. I did get that scholarship. I don't know why. I was always going to be an aeronautical engineer. I wasn't going to get there nursing, but my aunt thought I should go into nursing. And I was real good and liked it. But I had met my brothers. I would go to all the baseball games because my 2 brothers were good at sports and stuff, you know. And I met Red. And all of a sudden he came by one day, the little story goes, to pick up my brothers to go to Northwestern to the football game. He has tickets and they weren't home. So then he left and then he came back and he said, well, how would you like to go? So then I went with him and that was the start. I think we were married within the year. So, and then, and you cannot be in nurses training and be married. That was pretty weird. Yeah. So that's what happened. That's it.
Did you have any friends who became nurses or?
Yes, my best friend also became a nurse with me. We went in together. The story about Roseanne was, I thought she was my maid of honor when we got married, but she was already married. And before you have to remember, I had to leave, right, because I got married, but Roseanne stayed. All of a sudden, Roseanne is expecting. Uh-oh. So she had to leave. So she really was a matron of honor when we got married, but I didn't know it. So that's it. But she had 7 children too, so that's pretty good. So that was interesting. So then
What year did you have your first kid?
1952. Was married in 1950. Graduated in 49. Got married in 50. And first child in 52. Right. Same year Bob was born.
Can you actually can you describe your wedding a bit?
It was like 100 in the shade. Oh, it was the hottest day, July 8th. And so I didn't have to buy a wedding dress. I wore this cousin's, and this, it's my aunt's cousin. Okay, so I'm 5'4", and she must have been about 5'8" at least. It's really long and big, and long sleeves and satin. It was so hot. Wow, that's the main thing I remember of the wedding, actually, was at St. Margaret Mary's, and we have the longest aisle there to go down. It's very nice. And we had, I had 3 bridesmaids, and Red had 3 gentlemen. That's good. And we went to the Dells for the honeymoon. And after that, every year we took our kids to the Dells for about the next 20 years for our vacation.
Was there a specific hotel that you went to or anything, or a house in the Dells?
Oh, right. Yes. Where we went, they were so nice. They just loved us because we were just a nice little married couple, you know. So we stayed right next door to them and did all our fun things with them. And they would make big chicken dinners for us and onion rings for Red. It was really fun. So then when we started coming with the kids, it was perfect. It was right on Lake Delton. So we were right on the water. So that was, and we didn't really have any money. I don't know how we even got to go to the Dells, but we just stayed there. If you go to the Dells now, you spend all this money, you know, going downtown and doing all this stuff. Well, we would just stay right at our little cute little house and play in the water, and it was really nice. Right. But I guess I didn't tell you that much about the wedding, but
So then Bob, you were born in 52. What was your favorite activities like outside of school to be doing when you were growing up
Oh,
as
well,
a little kid?
when I was a kid, my three favorite sports were baseball, baseball, and baseball. I mean, I loved baseball and played it all the time. In the summer, we'd play outside. In spring and fall, we'd play outside. And when the snow started to fly, we'd go in the house and play in the basement. I had 2 brothers, and we had 2 or 3 different kind of sort of baseball games where we'd be pitching balls and hitting them in the basement. It was an unfinished basement. But you know, we still kind of made our mother pretty anxious that we were swinging bats and hit balls in the basement of the house. It wasn't that big a basement. So we eventually had to rely on, we would roll up magazines for bats and use different kinds of like paper wads and ping pong balls and all those balls, because they forbid us from using baseballs and bats in the basement after not too long. So couldn't even use wiffle balls and bats. It wouldn't let us do that. We used to play wiffle ball in our backyard. And we had an easement for an alley behind the house. There was never an alley there. It was just, eventually they just retired that and gave the property to the owners. But in my day, it was still, there was a fence on our side and a fence on the neighbor's side behind us. And there was the easement was just grass and dirt, but it was like, unused. And you'd hit it to the back of the yard into the easement, that was a home run. But if you hit it so far, it went over into the neighbor's yard behind us into his flower bed, that was an automatic 3 outs. And you had to go climb the fence and get the ball because the neighbor did not like us jumping in his yard and crushing his flowers. So everyone else would go run and hide in the garage, and you'd have to go get the ball if you hit it over the second fence. So we had a reasonably big backyard at that time. So yeah, so I like baseball a lot, and started playing as I got older. I started playing basketball also, but when I was a little kid, it was just baseball.
Right.
And well, the other thing in the winter, the other thing we would play was table hockey. With the little sticks in the men, and you twist them and hit a puck around on the board.
Mhm.
Used to play that all the time. That was fun.
Who was like the best out of you and your brothers?
Oh, well, I was the best.
Yeah.
He's the middle.
I'm the middle kid, but I was the best table hockey player. My brothers used to like stop playing me because they couldn't win, and I'd have to like spot them goals. Used to play to 12 goals was a game because there was a clock on top of the board we had, and if you went around the clock back to 12 and score. So I would give them 11 goal leads and still beat them. But then they'd like freeze me out for like 3 months, 6 months, playing each other every day and making me feel miserable because they wouldn't play me. And then they'd try playing me again, and like they still couldn't beat me. I went on. I played. I was even playing table hockey in college. There were other people that played it, and I played against other people there. It was kind of fun. There was a national table hockey tournament in Arizona when I was a freshman or sophomore in college, and I thought about sneaking out of school and going 2,000 miles across the country to play in the tournament.
Mhm.
But I couldn't tell my parents I was doing it. So in the end, I decided, maybe I better not. So I didn't go. But yeah, that was always fun. I was always good at that. Which was good because when it came to sports, I had good hands and no feet.
He couldn't jump like that.
My joke is that I'm the only person I know that when I jump, I go down. I once playing basketball. This is later when I was older. I was playing in a league, and I was a good shooter, and I catch a ball out by the 3-point line on a pass, and the defender comes at me, and I give him a little fake, and the guy flies by me, and then I go to take the shot. The referee blew the whistle and he said, when I made the fake, I left the ground. And I walked over to him with a big smile and handed him the basketball and said, well, thank you. I said, you're the first person that ever believed I got off the floor. The referee laughed the whole rest of the day. Every time he looked at me, and I got every call the rest of the night because he would just laugh every time he saw me. So,
Did you play basketball outside of like high school, or did you play in college at all? Or
no, I played in college. I did play. They had it. I went to University of Notre Dame, and they had what they call inter-hall sports, where
Intramural, right?
it's not an intramural. Students from one dormitory would play students from another dormitory, right? And they would have like a league that was for the students. And I played on the Flanner Hall softball team. I was a third baseman. And freshman year, we won the school championship. We defeated everybody. And our final championship game was the evening before my first final exam. And so we won the game and did some celebrating, and I didn't study too much for that final exam the next day.
But you did
So-
great anyway.
Well, it wasn't my best grade at Notre Dame, let's say that.
So
But
then,
it was very fun to win that. And then when I was in graduate school there, I also played, they had graduate school teams. And I played, there was a Park District baseball team in South Bend that I played one summer on that baseball team. And after I was older and married and kids, I played softball in Park District leagues here in the Chicago area. So yeah, so I played a lot of baseball and softball.
then kind of going back to the 50s and 60s, when you were growing up, that was kind of like a big time with the Cold War. Like, was that something that like you were really aware of, like in your family and stuff? Like,
Oh, sure.
the
I was
war
aware of the
happened.
Cold War because they used to do these things. They used to have atomic bomb drills in case like the Russians would shoot an atomic bomb at us. The kind of duck and cover drills where they'd have you all, you'd have to get up from your desk. You have to go sit under your desk and put your head between your knees. Yeah, there's, we used to joke about it and say, thinking, what good is this going to do if an atomic bomb hits? And we would say, well, this is that you put your head between your knees and kiss your backside goodbye. Is what we would say as kids in school. We were like, but this was very much things going on in the 50s. The Cold War was a big deal and a lot of tension around this. And then in 1961 was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is where the Russians secretly were putting intercontinental ballistic missiles with atomic warheads in Cuba. So they would, and as they were doing this, I mean, the US found them out. And
It was under Kennedy.
right, Kennedy was president and worked to stop them. So first they put a naval blockade out so that the Russians couldn't bring shiploads full of these missiles in. But then the Russians threatened escalation if they weren't allowed to do this. And it was very tense, and everyone was thinking this is gonna turn into a nuclear war. In the end, it got resolved. I believe what happened was that President Kennedy made a secret deal with the Russians to withdraw missiles from Turkey if the Russians would take the missiles out of Cuba. And that secret deal saved the day, because and the president couldn't do this publicly because there was a lot of sentiment against doing that in the United States. But the Russians wanted some concession to stop doing what they were doing. So that was very scary. Very scary. And of course, at that time, Cuba had just been, they just had a revolution in Cuba, a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro, right? That was, and he took over the country in 1959. I remember that. And that was
still communist.
And that was a big deal because it was the first intrusion in the Western Hemisphere of, Soviet style socialism. And it was a big, big deal. I mean, a lot, and very scary for everybody. Because everyone was, scared of Russian expansion. So yeah, so there was a lot of Cold War stuff. And even the whole space program that went on through the 1960s and into the 70s was very much viewed as part of the Cold War. Who was ahead? Who was better? Because the fear was the Russians would send rockets into space and they were going to send nuclear warheads onto the rockets in space, and then they could drop them from the skies onto the US anytime they wanted, was the idea. And so we had to beat them at their own game kind of thing. So when in the late 50s, the Russians put up Sputnik, which was an unmanned satellite that was orbiting the Earth, it was a big deal. People would go out in their backyards at night to watch this one little dot of light in the sky that you could see, and the sun would reflect off it. And you could see it going across the sky. And we'd all look at it and like, it was just like this overwhelming thing. I mean, now there's man-made satellites, thousands of them in the sky all the time, right? Back then, that was the first one. There wasn't anything.
What year was that?
57 or 8, I think, was when they put Sputnik up.
And then 10 years later, they got to the moon. So that was big, right?
Right. So there was a lot with the space race that was going on. We were all watching it from the first. You'd hear about what the Russians had done, and then
Right,
we'd
well,
do something.
Russians did it first.
Remember, our first space shot was Alan Shepard just going up into space and coming back down, no orbiting. And then John Glenn orbited the Earth, first one to orbit the Earth. You're supposed to go 7 times around. He went 3 times around, and some warning light went on that suggested that the heat shield was loose. And they said, well, they shut it off, so they got to come down right away. And so everyone is, so they're bringing them down, but they don't know whether the heat shield is still attached or not. There's no way to look.
Very tense.
And so they sent, he's coming down, he has to go through the, comes down through the atmosphere. When that happens, there's a radio blackout because you can't get a radio signal through the kind of intense, the intensity of the heat and all and around the capsule. I don't know exactly why, but there'd be this period of time, it would be like 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, where when they're coming down, where you could not communicate. And so he's coming down and everyone's going, doesn't know, is he burning up? Is he dead? Is capsule coming down? And then it went like past the longest time anyone else had ever been silent. It went past 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes. And we're
The
like,
whole world's listening.
and we're all thinking, he's dead, and they keep going, so they keep asking him, like, are you there? Can you hear us?
Say something.
This is Houston calling. And finally, all of a sudden he goes, oh, I'm here. Everything was fine. The heat shield held, and it was this big relief. But every time someone went up, it was an international event. Anytime anyone went into space, it became so routine finally in the end. Now, and people go up all the time. We don't even keep track of who goes up into space anymore. But everything would, when there'd be a space launch, it was covered on national TV and everyone would stop. And if you were in school when it was going off, they'd stop having classes and they turn on the television to watch the launch. It was huge. And and Kennedy made I think in 61 or maybe 62, set the goal of getting to the moon by the end of the decade. And we did. It landed on the moon in July of 69. And I remember it exactly. It's one of those things where you remember where you are when it happened, like famous, a big event. Do you remember where you are? I was in Florence, Italy, which was very strange, watching it on Italian television. So all the communications between the astronauts on the moon and the people on Earth,
Same thing.
were all going on in the background, and you could kind of hear it, but then there'd be all these people, the announcers on the Italian television station talking in Italian, which I didn't understand. And I was like, you're trying to listen past their voices to what was actually happening, but they never stopped talking.
Really.
So it was quite difficult, but it was still exciting to watch that from, someplace else.
Mrs. DeLorenzo, do you remember where you were when the?
Oh, yes. not nearly as exciting. Grandma had a new apartment and we had gone to her apartment and decided we'll stay and see what happens with the space thing.
And you were
Yeah.
you were 8.5 months pregnant.
Oh, really? I guess.
Amy was born August 69, right?
December.
Amy's August.
Oh, I thought you said
Amy.
Oh, Amy, right. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Come to think of it.
Yeah.
Thanks for remembering.
Well, I mean, I only know that
Yeah, right. I guess so. I didn't put two and two
child number 8 was born in August 20th. So yeah, you were about 8 months pregnant. It was the end of July when they landed. So, but you didn't name Amy after any kind of space
It might
person.
have been yeah. Amos and Andy. I
Yeah.
don't know where we got Amy from. Julie. Right,
So, those are kind of things. That was a big deal.
right. Big memories. I remember
Yeah.
Riverview was my big thing from the old days.
The old amusement park. I was only there once.
Oh, and they never should have closed it. Most of those old ones, a lot of them stayed open. It was really 2 cents to get in, and all the rides were 2 cents each. On 2 cents stay. They had wonderful rides. Right.
I think those are big things back. And I mean, they were, when I was growing up, they were still around, but they were kind of disappearing.
I think 66 it closed, but we were the best. It was all, the Bob's was all wood, and they had this water ride. You'd have to go up on an elevator and then come down. So very exciting. But the fact that it was so cheap, we get around on streetcars, So, and that was only 2 cents for the streetcar. I just can't believe the difference in prices. And 2 cents to get in and 2 cents for a ride.
So it was right off Belmont Avenue, right?
Right, yes.
And my father grew up about a mile west of Riverview, right
Okay.
on Belmont, Belmont Avenue. He
Yeah.
lived just a house or two south of Belmont. And I thought of that when he talked about the streetcar, because they used to play baseball in the street on his side street, and Belmont Avenue was center field
Oops.
at the intersection. And Belmont was center field.
Was that streetcars too?
And there were streetcars on Belmont, and
That's exciting.
he would say that they'd have to stop their game when the streetcar would come by. As a streetcar, there wasn't much other traffic, he said, but the streetcar would come by. And then when this is in the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s. My dad was born in 1923, and so he played there right by, and he went to Riverview.
Of course. I get a cousin.
He was also a big baseball fan. I think that's why I was such a baseball fan. He could take the streetcar west as a kid and go all the way west over to near Wrigley Field. And he'd walk the Belmont to Addison was
About half
half a mile.
Right.
So you take the streetcar down Belmont all the way to Clark, and then he'd walk up Clark the half a mile to the ballpark.
Right.
And
The tickets were only 50 cents when I grew up. I wonder how much they are now. Oh my goodness.
and I would always hear the stories back in those days. There were no outfield stands like there are in Wrigley Field now. There were only
Bleachers?
bleachers like you'd
outfield.
see at a high school football game, just the wooden bleachers.
Yeah, we had a lot of bleachers.
Yeah,
That was
so-
50 cents.
And so he would always try and sneak in from the bleachers, and there'd be people sitting in the bleachers, and they would reach down and grab you and pull you up into the stands.
Mm,
And my dad would tell stories about that's how we go to the baseball games. He'd get pulled up by people into the stands without paying.
I've never heard that. I never knew about that. I might have tried that.
But then they built the new outfield brick wall, and permanent.
But they would have ladies' day, and then it was free. So I was only 12, but my mom would kind of dress me up to look older. And so I would get in as a lady too. So, love the Cubs.
When was Ladies' Day?
Ladies' Day.
I think every Friday, wasn't it?
I
Or
thought it
something
was
like
Tu-
that.
no, I
Every
think
Tuesday,
Tues-
something. There's
Tuesday
one
was
day of the
Ladies'
week
Day.
that was Ladies' Day, and all women and girls got in free.
Yep.
Now in these
Well,
years,
not girls, so you had to be, you're supposed to be a lady.
yeah,
But,
yeah, I don't remember that. Well,
Yeah.
by the time I was doing, it,
yeah,
I think it was all girls were free.
okay, that was the 40s. Most of my
But-
memories are 40s.
In the 50s, that I remember this.
Of all the
The
girls
Cubs
free.
were, my father said the Cubs were the strongest team in the National League. They held everyone else up, meaning they were in last place always.
Mm, Very bad.
And in a typical game, there'd only be about 2,000 or 3,000 people would go.
Wow.
So the park was almost empty, you know.
But then in the
yeah.
40s, it was much better.
Well, in the 40s, they won
We
the
won the
pennant
pennant.
in 45, yeah.
Right.
But by the 50s, they were the worst team in baseball. And
Right now, we're just about that. Actually, we just won 3 games.
yeah,
Right.
anyway, so baseball, yeah, was my sport. Watching the Cubs, playing baseball. All my heroes were players on the Cubs. You know, and
Did
it
you
was
have a favorite
top
player growing up?
conversation with my dad growing up. You know, how the Cubs were going to do, and you know, he would always ask me what I thought of the players, and he'd tell me what he thought of the players, and we did that all the way through his life. He just died in 2017, the year after they won the World Series.
Yeah.
At 94, he died, and it was when they won the World Series. The game didn't end till like 2 o'clock in the morning, and my 93-year-old at that time grandfather stayed up till 2 in the morning watching the game, and he called me as soon as the game ended. He was so
Sure.
excited, going, "We won! We won! We won!" You know, and I'm thinking, "He's 93, and you know, this was a big deal for him."
Mhm.
So that was fun. But we're not talking about the 50s or 60s.
It's more the
Um,
40s. I know the war.
Well, I was kind of thinking. So, Mama said that you went on like vacations every summer. Did you do that?
When I was a kid, my parents would organize a summer vacation every summer. Sometime around February, usually February, when it's cold and snowy and dark. My father would come home with maps and brochures and everything, and we'd start organizing, where are we going to go this summer? And we'd lay out maps on the living room floor, and we'd be looking at them and talking about them. And, he'd always have some idea where we were going, but he included us in the process, and we'd go on some trips. So I remember going to New York and Boston, to Washington, D.C. and Gettysburg, to Denver and the Rocky Mountains. One year, it's 1960 maybe. I'm not sure. I think maybe 1960, we took a train from Chicago to Los Angeles. And this was my mom's sister, my Aunt Alice, worked for the railroads. She was the executive secretary to the president of the Passenger Railroad Association. So this one, railroads were still like the main form of transportation. Airplane rides were still, in the 1950s, they had them, but they weren't considered the safest way. And all the kind of fancy trains that if you remember from the old movies, if you've ever seen old movies about people sitting in, dining cars and, having
Very fancy.
having sleeper cars and all these things, were still around. And my aunt was like, these things aren't going to last. Airplanes are taking over. You have to take a big trip on one of these trains before they disappear. So we all, my parents agreed, and we had this trip where we took the train from Chicago to Los Angeles. They rented a car when we got to Los Angeles. And of course, in Los Angeles, we went to Disneyland, which was open at that time.
Yeah.
I was still too little to go on some of the rides my own. You had to be a certain height. And I was like, a half an inch too short to go on some of the rides, which
Yeah,
is really
'cause it opened in the
really
60s.
disappointing. This was a new deal and a big deal. So I saw Los Angeles, and then we drove all the way up the coast, stopping at all these like little towns, Santa Barbara and Carmel, and
Santa.
all these different places. Oh, and this was the story I wanted to tell you. We get to my aunt, because of working for the Passenger Railroad Association, was very involved with troop movements during World War II. As troops would move across the country, they'd all go by train. And so that's passenger rail. And so she knew all sorts of generals and admirals and all, because they'd come to talk to the president and they'd go through her, and she would often coordinate all these things that they would want to have happen. So my parents both worked at the railroad. That's where they met. And so they got to know some of these people as well through my aunt. Anyway, we're on this vacation in 1960. So, I mean, this is like 15 years after the war. And we're going up the coast, and we get to San Francisco. And when we get to our hotel, we're staying at what was a fancy hotel in San Francisco called the Mark Hopkins Hotel.
Yeah.
And we get there, and I remember it one way. My older brother remembers it another way. So I'll tell my older brother's way, because he's got a better memory for this. He says when we got to the hotel, there were 2 naval officers waiting for us. And they were like, "We need you to come with us to go see an aircraft, to go view the fleet in the harbor, because there's in San Francisco Bay, there was a huge naval base there. And the Pacific Fleet was stationed out of that thing." And my dad says, and it was like, the admiral wants, and they were like, the admiral says you have to go get on the aircraft carrier and tour his aircraft carrier. And my dad's like, "Oh, well, we'll go tomorrow. We just got here. We're here with friends," because we had driven up from Carmel with some friends of theirs. And they're like, no, you have to come. You have to come today. And he goes, "Why do I have to come today?" He says, the fleet leaves at midnight tonight. They're leaving the harbor. So you have to be on it today. He goes, "Well, we haven't eaten lunch." I said, "Well, come to lunch. We'll tell you, come to lunch at the Air Force, at the naval base." And so finally we give in. It's like we drive across the Golden Gate Bridge and to where the base is, just north of San Francisco. And they're waiting for us at the gates. And my dad pulls up and says who we are. And there's like cars and motorcycles with lights flashing and everything. They say, "Follow us." And they like escort us across, like zoom us across the base. And they take us to the officers' dining hall, and they feed us. And it's like there's this fancy place, and there's all these soldiers standing at attention wearing white gloves and these fancy uniforms. And there's I'm this little 8-year-old kid, picking at my nose and not know what's going on. And they're like serving you like you were at Downton Abbey, is the only way I could describe it now, this really formal setting. And after that, they take us on the aircraft carrier. The base photographer goes with us and takes pictures of us as we're here on the aircraft carrier and there on the aircraft carrier. We went all the way from the bottom and the workings all the way up to the top, to the admiral's chair at the top of the aircraft carrier, in the conning, whatever it's called, the conning tower, whatever it's called there. And we all had to sit in the admiral's chair. And all this, of course, because the admiral was a friend of my parents and my aunt, and wanted us to have that experience on our trip. And it was this huge day that we have, there's still a few pictures. I don't know what happened to all the pictures. There's still a few pictures of us on the aircraft carrier.
That was Aunt Alice. Alice?
Aunt Alice, well, it's because of Aunt Alice, but my parents knew this admiral as well. And so when he heard we were going to San Francisco, it was like,
Yeah,
we had to get on his aircraft carrier. When it turned out he was going to be there, we were going to be there while the fleet was in the harbor.
That was special.
We had to go, and these are like, I think these are like captains, you know, that are waiting on us. You know, they were captains and waiting on us and telling us we have to come, you know, because the admiral says you have to come, and there'll be in big trouble if we don't, you know, if we don't go, the admiral's going to be really angry with us, you know, kind of thing. So it was quite an experience, and it was all connected with, you know, what my parents did during the war. And you know, how they spent their time working with the railroads. And they were all involved with my mother. I don't know, my father was in the war, and my father was drafted, but my mother was still working at the railroad and involved with all the troop movements. My aunt was involved with all the troop movements. So they, you know, so it was a big deal when I went in 1960 to San Francisco. We ended up going all the way up to Seattle, and then took a train back from Seattle back to Chicago. All of it was pretty.
It's a great vacation.
That was tremendous. So we would take vacations like that. That was probably the most memorable one. We went up into Canada a few times, to Quebec and Montreal and places like that. Mostly in the United States, though. Never to Mexico or Point South. Never in the deep South. We never went to Florida or Louisiana or Texas or places like that, or Arizona.
Too hot.
Or Arizona. Yeah, probably too hot in the summer anyway.
Go north.
So, but yeah, we did those. Mama was at the Dells
Yeah.
with all the kids, and my parents were taking us all over.
I didn't get to those places till I was 50, and
Right.
Bob did it when he was 8. That's pretty
Yeah,
good.
so when we were little, it was like this.
But didn't the aunties take you to Europe too?
No.
No? Oh, I thought you had to go to
No.
Sweden.
No, I've never been to Sweden.
Oh, wow.
I was in Europe in 1969 when they
Oh.
landed on the moon.
Okay.
My high school was between junior and senior of high school. And the school had a program that was a summer program in Europe. And so I went to Europe for a month through that school program,
Very popular. Yeah.
which is very exciting. I went to Rome and Florence and Venice and Geneva and Paris and London. It was quite a deal. And it was, you know, I mean, first time I've ever done anything like that without family. It was, you know, that was a big experience. And
Actually, we had to go.
I grew up pretty much, I think, the month I was gone doing that kind of thing, because I was on my own every day. We were not in classes or anything, and there were teachers from the school that were around, but there was a whole group of people, and we were
In a different country.
we
That's
were not, you know, we were not toured, we were not led around on tours. We were free to do what we wanted all day, every day. You know, and they'd keep an eye on us, but they weren't shepherding us around. So, you know, that was a lot of freedom.
Did you have a favorite, like, town or city that you went to when you were in Europe? Or
Yeah, Rome.
Rome?
Rome was my favorite. It was the first city we went to, but it was my favorite. It was just amazing. And I've been back 3 times since. And it's still my favorite city.
Mhm.
It's really, I have not been to Stockholm, which I think I would like, and I have not been to Spain. What's the city in Spain?
Barcelona.
Barcelona. I've not been to Barcelona.
I got to Barcelona.
So people talk about those as being great cities. And I haven't been to Amsterdam. These are places I'd like to go.
So then, Mom, you just said, so you've been to Barcelona?
Yeah, what was really wonderful when Amy's one born in 69, right? Anyway, when she was a junior, they were taking a trip to Europe, the choir, you know, and parents and everybody else could go. But we'd always been so poor, we never went anywhere, but it was only like $700, and neighbors, the aunties even, they put money in a coffee thing for me, and we all collected money, and we got to go to all those countries, 10 countries. was just the best thing ever.
Yeah, I do believe that my trip, a month in Europe,
Oh, we had a month.
it was a
Wow.
month in Europe, airfare there, lodgings. I think some of the meals were included.
Yeah, I wonder
Breakfast,
how
I
much
think,
that
I
was.
think breakfast was included every day. And transportation from all city to cities, and I think
Right.
that was $600.
Mm,
So things, prices were a little different back then.
wow, because ours was in 1985. So it was 20 years later, right?
Right,
I think it was only 700, but
yeah.
that was really good.
So, but I mean,
And we did Italy and Rome and all that. But then, since then, I got so into it. We've been back about 10 times, I think. It's really good.
Yeah.
Like to go to Europe.
so, the Cold War went on. We'll go back to where we were talking about the
Oh,
Cold
yeah,
War.
that's right.
And that kind of, the Vietnam War was a continuation of the Cold War.
What
Because,
about the Korean? How did that fit in?
well, that
there?
was the Cold War too. I mean, so after World War II, they hadn't really, where the Japanese were at the end of the war and what was occupied by Japanese and what was occupied by other allied countries, was kind of, those countries are all kind of in flux, and decisions were made about who was going to stay and who's going to be in charge, and were the allied armies going to stay there, or were they just going to leave and turn the country over to the people that were there? And a lot of the European powers were kind of hanging on and spending time in the people weren't paying much attention to what was going on in Korea. It had been a place where the Japanese had been.
Yeah.
And there had been people, including the Russians were fighting against the Japanese, and they had progressed as far as the northern part of Korea
Yeah, I didn't really pay much attention.
when the war ended. But then it was like, someone drew a line saying, well, the Russians are up there, but they're not down here, and without thinking much about it. And, there was like a vacuum. The US moved into support, to aid, occupy, whatever you want to call it, South Korea. And pretty quickly there was, disputes over the border, and the Koreans wanting the country to be united, and the Russians and the Americans using Korea as a proxy for, the Cold War.
Mhm.
And as I recall, there was some provocation that caused the Americans to invade North Korea,
Mhm.
and they were doing really well until at one point, all of a sudden, China got into the war, and their troops came, and
Trouble.
tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many Chinese
killed.
troops came in, and they pushed the Americans back, and the Americans were in pretty much full retreat with lots of casualties. And it looked like for a while that the US was going to be pushed right off the Korean Peninsula. But then they, made some military maneuvers, and they somehow got behind the Chinese lines, and with a daring landing, and they were able to stop it, and eventually the whole thing stabilized right where it had been at the end of the war, at the
So
end of
the
World War II.
same boundaries, really?
I think
Oh,
pretty much the same
yeah, I
boundary. I
always
think,
wondered about that. Did
But
you
they-
study that, Jack?
the Korean War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but that was one of them, and then so that was what was going on there. Then Vietnam was also going on. That was a casualty of World War II. At the end of the war, the Chinese had kicked the Japanese out of the northern half of Vietnam. The British had who were fighting the Japanese in the south part of Vietnam and occupied it at the end of the war. And then the Chinese troops went home, and the British troops stuck around with the idea that French Indochina, which is what it was before the war, they were French colonies, they hung around until the French could come back in and establish control,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Advance.
So then the French were in control and wanting to get all of Vietnam and all of Indochina back again. But the people in the north, after the Chinese went home, were like, we don't want the French back here. And so they started a war against the French. It was like, what's interesting is that during the war, the Vietnamese had fought on the side of the Allies. And in fact, America, the United States, had promised the Vietnamese that after the war, it was, you know, they could fight with the Allies, and then it would be Vietnam for the Vietnamese after the war. But then the British were big on giving it back to the French, and they lobbied the Americans, and Truman, there were advisors that told Truman, yeah, you got to give this back to the French so that they have a strong country so that Germany doesn't ever rise up again. And so out of all that, the French came back in and they fought a losing battle against the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese were looking for some ally to help them fight against the French, because it wasn't going to be the Americans. And they started getting supplies from Russia. And all of a sudden it became this proxy war again, like Korea was. And the French eventually lost and were pulled out, and the Americans filled the void. And that's where the Vietnam War came from.
But then how did it end? Didn't the Russians stay in or something? Because why did all those people come and live next door? Vietnam people came to America.
Well, yeah, the war was a stalemate, essentially. The North Vietnamese pretty much lost every major battle that was fought, but they kept coming. They were persistent. And, so all through my high school, so all through my years when I was in high school and then into college is when the war was raging. We had many thousands of troops over there. President Nixon in the early 70s eventually just pulled all the troops out, and they kind of pulled out and ran. I mean, it was like, to get out, they were getting out and running away, and of course then the North Vietnamese troops were coming in, and all the people in the South who worked with the Americans were seen as traitors, and they were treated very badly. And so a lot of them
came to America.
They came to America. They jumped on boats. The Americans didn't help them much, but they jumped on boats and got out of the country, and they tried to come to the U.S., and many of them made it. We had a lady that ran a Vietnamese restaurant just a couple blocks from our house for many years, and she was one of these, what they call them, boat people. They got on a boat, like a little tiny boat, and went out into the ocean.
Wow.
And then, had to be rescued
Right.
out on the ocean by a bigger ship. Many people died doing that, but she survived and came to the U.S. and
Our favorite restaurant.
opened up our favorite Vietnamese restaurant. But that was going on. So when I'm growing up now, when I'm old enough, I'm born in 52. So by 1970, I'm graduating high school. And when you turned 18 in those days, there was still a military draft going on. There had been since the war. And then there was the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and the draft was still there. So when you turned 18, you had to register for the draft. And every year they would have a draft, they would have a lottery. So based on the year that you were turned 18, they do have this big lottery thing. It would be on TV. It would be like, they'd have two big buckets. And one bucket would have every date of the year, January 1st to December 31st, right? The other bucket would have numbers from 1 to 365. So they pull one out and they say, okay, May 5th, number 17. And so that was anybody that was, was on May 5th was the 17th group of people that would be called. So it's by your birthday, which you'd be called.
Mm.
So, if your number was anywhere from 1 to 100, you were likely going to be drafted and sent to Vietnam, which was scary, right?
Do you guys know many people who were sent to Vietnam?
I do. I had
Did
friends
you?
that went and were killed in Vietnam. I had friends that were wounded and survived. Yes.
They're such a
So
waste.
I mean, that was going on. It was scary, and it was it was a big deal, and it was all this proxy Cold War stuff. That was what it was all about, and so I remember my older brother's 2 years older, so we were watching his draft number come up in 1968. That's when he turned 18. So I was looking to see what my number would have been, right?
Mhm.
And so they picked my birthday, and the number, not my year, I'm not in it, my brother's year. My number would have been in that year 356 out of 365. And I'm like, oh no. And then the next year, I'm still not in it because that's the year I turned 17. And my number comes up, and I would have been, I think it was 342. And now I'm thinking, I'm in big trouble. 2 years I'm not in, it's right at the end. I figure I'm going to be number 2, my number's going to get picked, and I'm going to be in, they're going to be drafting me. But when I turned 18, my number came up and I was 220.
That's pretty safe.
So that was, they only went to they were only going up to about 100. So I wasn't going to get drafted. But I mean, like you lived, your life was on the line that day when they pulled the numbers. Right. And that was true for my brothers, for myself, for all my in-laws. Well, Danny was the only one that was old enough.
Right.
Yeah. So
It's exciting.
those were scary times, and of course there was a lot going on relative to, the war, and there was a lot of opposition to the war.
Mhm.
I mean, it started out in the early 60s under Kennedy with just advisors because the French were still there. And he had sent a few more troops in, and Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, when Johnson became president, he sent a lot of troops there. And Nixon sent even more. And it became more and more of an issue that was dividing the country, and there were protests going on. There was
Were you in?
Movies.
there was a big thing. The 1968 Democratic National Convention was in Chicago, and
Big time.
it was a big deal. The war was the number one issue. Johnson decided not to run for a second term. And there were a number of candidates. Robert Kennedy was running for president, and he was assassinated after he won the California primary. In the hotel where he was giving his speech about winning the primary, as he's walking out of that, he's still in the room where he gave the speech, and as he steps down from the stage, a man steps up and shoots him and kills him.
Martin Luther King.
Well,
right?
Martin
Was
Luther
it-
King was killed in April. That's civil rights movement.
68
But
was bad.
April 4th, 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and and then there were all sorts of riots that took place as a result of that. And then so there was a lot of anti-war sentiment coming, trying to promote ending the war that was happening around the Democratic Convention in 68. And Gene McCarthy was the the Democratic senator who was running on an anti-war platform. And Hubert Humphreys was the kind of
I like him the best.
mainstream candidate. He had been Johnson's vice president. So he was going from the vice presidency, he was going to run for president. And a lot of different groups from around the country came to Chicago with the idea of engaging in peaceful protest against the war.
So you went to that, or did you not?
Well, so they were all protesting in Grant Park in downtown Chicago. I wanted to go, but my parents pretty unequivocally said, not only are you not going, you're not leaving the house.
And us too.
Now, two of my good friends wanted to go. And they were clever enough. My one friend, Dan, told his parents he was going to stay over at Mike's house overnight. And Mike told his parents that he was going to go stay overnight at Dan's house. And their
They fell
parents were
for it.
trusting enough and they fell for it. And they both went and got on the train and took the train downtown and went to the protests. But I watched them on TV. And this is all live on TV.
Were there any protests that?
It all, and so there were, and I don't know all the specifics of who was doing what or when, how exactly what the laws were and all, but that they had permits to do their protest rallies in Grant Park. But then when there was some, but this was not clear when it got to be a certain time. I don't remember what it was, 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or whatever. They told the protesters, you must leave the park. The park is now closed. And they pushed all the people out of the park and down a particular street, and they blocked off the streets with police. So they had to go down this one particular street. And they got as far as they got, and then there was a wall of police there on that street. And so the protesters were stopped, and then the police charged into the crowd with their billy clubs and started beating people. And everybody ran, and many people, the people that left ran back to the park. There were other people that didn't leave the park. And that people were getting tear gassed and beaten, and it was crazy. And the cheer, the chant that protesters came up with, because this was on national television, this was on all around the world, they started chanting, "The whole world is watching." And this was like a chant, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching what you're doing to us while we're trying to protest." It was a huge deal.
Very memorable.
And was so upsetting to so many people in the country that Nixon won the election. Humphrey got the nomination, but he lost in a very close race to Nixon. But it was the aftermath of the craziness of the convention and the protesting that made it.
Protests can change the whole picture.
But it didn't, things went on, and I have to say, this is the other, so these are all my high school years. And the next year, and then the war is still going on, Nixon's president, he's not stopping the war. In 1970, there's more and more protests on college campuses because it's the college, it's college age kids that are getting drafted, right? So we're all protesting. Now I'm still in high school at this point. But 1970, there was a protest that was going on at Kent State College in Ohio. And the governor of Ohio had called out the Ohio National Guard to keep them in line. or something, I'm not sure. And while they were protesting on campus, the National Guard was there, and they were up on a hill, not too far away from where the protesters were. And at some point, the National Guard started shooting into the crowd.
Makes sense.
And 4 of the students, protesters, were killed. A number of others wounded and injured. There's a fascinating story that I found out, you read about since. One of the student newspaper people was there with his camera to take pictures. He only had a few, this is film days, there's no digital cameras. He only had a few pictures left on the roll of film. And the shooting starts. And he said that he looked up and saw, he claims he looked up and saw one of the National Guards looking right at him and pointing the gun right at him and shooting at him, but missing. And this person, one of the people that died, get shot, and there's a girl that's like kneeling on the ground, like crying and all upset, this person's dead and everyone's running. And she's like, he's dying right here, he's in a pool of blood, and she's like upset, saying, he needs help, he needs help. And this guy snaps a picture of it. It became the kind of iconic picture of
Kent State.
Kent State,
right?
And what happened there. In fact, and he had not been sent by the news agencies. And so when he said, I've got this picture from what happened, they said, yeah, we got plenty of pictures, we don't need it. He sent it anyway. And they were all like, oh my gosh. And this is one of those iconic pictures against the war that I think helped turn the tide. I had a good friend that I worked with for many years who was there at Kent State when that happened. So it's like, this is the kind of thing that so I was thinking about this when you asked me to do this. It's like all my years in high school, right?
Was it 60s?
It was, I'm thinking about these things that are going on. What's going on? Martin Luther King is being shot. Robert Kennedy is being shot. Civil rights protests are going on. And those people are being treated brutally. The racism in the country was horrendous back then. The war is going on. People are, getting drafted. People are protesting against the war. I got involved in protesting against the war. And the Democratic Convention was the summer between my sophomore and junior years of high school. Kent State happened during my senior year of high school. And after the shootings of the students in Kent State, all the colleges across the country shut down and sent all the students home. College ended in the United States for the rest of that. It was kind of like the pandemic. Everybody shut down and went home, right? But it was the shooting, after the shootings there and the students dying, protests raised significantly on every college campus around the country. And they just said, every university said, we're done, semester's over, go home. And everybody came back that following September, and going back that September is when I went into college. So I started college in the semester after it had all been shut down as a result of what happened at Kent State. So all that's happening. And I went to Europe and watched them land on the moon.
The next year, right?
And in '69, that same year, the Cubs almost won the pennant, and they collapsed. They collapsed in September, and the Mets came
like
from
20 games ahead going into it, weren't we?
Yeah, and the Cubs were like the team, and everyone thought, well, they're the best team in baseball. And then the Mets, with their young pitching staff, they had all these like tremendous rookie arms of people that went on to be Hall of Fame pitchers. They won, I think it was 22 of their last 24 or 23 of their last 24 games in the season, and were able to pass the Cubs Cubs were playing like 500 ball.
Yeah.
They were getting a little tired, I think. Um, and the Mets passed them and won the pennant. In those years, it was like there's no playoffs. There was just one league. Whoever had the best record in the National League went to the World Series against
The American League.
the
right,
American
yeah.
League team. So
Mhm.
anyway, so my beloved Cubs were getting us all excited and then failing in the end. We were
Mhm.
landing on the moon,
Very
protesting the war in Vietnam, civil rights movement going on. It was like crazy times. People were getting assassinated left and right. Martin Luther King was not the only civil rights leader that was assassinated. There were several other leading protesters, Black American protesters, leaders that were assassinated. Medgar Evers was one of them. I'm trying to think the names of the others. There were also people that would come. So a lot of these protests were going on in the South, where there are all these segregation
Mhm.
laws, and there were a lot of young people, college age students, and recent college graduates who would. They were called freedom riders. They got on buses up north and they rode the buses down to the south to protest alongside the civil rights marchers, right?
Mhm.
Well, these people were vilified by Southerners
Yeah.
because they're siding with the enemy, kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
And there are any number of these freedom riders that were literally taken out and shot or hung or
Wow.
disappeared
Mm.
in the South in these years. It was, horrendous stuff that was going on, and they were thought, well, they deserve this stuff because they're, troublemakers, northern troublemakers coming down here telling us how we should live our lives, kind of thing was how they would describe them. And so they were like, it was almost like anything goes against these people. And finally, with all that stuff going on, federal troops had to be sent into the South to protect the civil rights people. But that was scary as could be, right there, that stuff. So that's what life was like when I was in high school. So I was thinking about this. All that stuff was like, think about what's going on in your 4 years of high school. This is what the 4 years of high school was like for me. The world was there's craziness now, a whole different kind of craziness. We didn't have anybody, we had a lot of protesting going on, but we didn't have people storming the Capitol building and trying to, capture and get at Congress, nobody did that. But there was still a lot of protests going on around the country. And in all that, in April of 1971, is when I met Margie, my wife. And that was just, I was just telling her it was on April 30th, 1971, when we met. I remember the date. And so we just had our 50th anniversary of the date that we met was just a few days ago.
Ooh.
It was last Friday. So
So what was going on when you guys first met?
what's that?
What were you guys doing when you first met?
I was a substitute date for one of her friends for their senior prom. It was my freshman year of college. And one of my good friends had been dating a friend of Margie's, although I didn't. So I knew the girl that he was dating, but I did not know Margie. And they broke up shortly before the prom. So this girl, her name was Lynn, had already paid for the prom. You know, he had to pay to go, pay for dinner, pay for, you know, all this stuff. There was a thing she had gotten her dress and prom dress and all this stuff.
Up
And
to the
so she was
rescue.
stuck. So they were looking for a substitute date for the prom. And I was asked to be the substitute date and said yes. Right.
You said you kind of liked her even
Cool.
before that, right? Or was
Margie?
that the first you
That's
met
when
her?
I met her.
Oh, that was
So I
it.
go to the prom, and this girl, Lynn, was a friend of Margie's, and they were sitting at the same table
Mm.
for the prom. So there she is sitting across, you know, across the table from me.
Mm.
And I was smitten.
What?
And she wasn't as smitten as I was. I spent the entire summer of 1971 calling her up and asking her out on dates. And she said no every time. So, but by the end of the summer, we met at a party. The same friend that had
She there played
dumped,
date?
got me, split up with his girlfriend, was having a party. He was actually had decided to join the seminary. And so he was leaving Chicago, and there was a big goodbye party for him. And when we were good friends, so I was there, and Margie knew him as well.
Is that Robert?
Robert, yeah. And so we were both at the party, and so I went over to her at the party and talked to her, and we hung out that whole evening at the party. And then we started, you know, I mean, the next day 2 days later, I was off at college again, but we were writing letters, and I would come back and see her, and that started the romance. So that's what I was doing.
Cutest thing was the Cracker Jack thing.
Well,
That's cute.
my wife, Margie, when we decided we were getting married, she said, okay, but there's no way you're buying a ring without me, right? She didn't want me to buy something that she wasn't going to be happy with. So I immediately took that to be a challenge, which was probably a dumb thing to do. And I went and bought a ring, but then it had to be put in a setting and everything.
Oh, wow, wow.
And so Margie, so I knew that, so my parents picked it up here in Chicago and put it in a box, and they put it in a bag with like clothes and a few other things. And they called Margie, who was coming to visit me at school, and said, we've got some clothes and things for Bob. Could you bring them to him? And then she said, yes. She took the South Shore train down to Notre Dame. And my parents said, okay, Margie's got the ring. She doesn't know it. It's in the bag, you know? And so I was to be sure that she didn't leave the bag on the train or, you know,
Oh, that's
anything
how
else.
it happened then.
Well, so she brought the ring down unknowingly, but I had opened up, she always liked Cracker Jacks and the prizes. So I had opened up a box of Cracker Jack and taken out the prize. And when I got, and had it waiting for it, and when I
But it
got,
often was a ring. Right?
well, the ring was one of the things you got in Cracker Jack.
Yeah.
So I took this engagement ring and I put it in a little package and resealed the package and put it in back with the Cracker Jack and closed the box up and sealed the box again. And then I gave the box to my good friend, Phil Schuster, and had him walk into my dorm room with the box of Cracker Jack.
Mhm.
And Margie liked Cracker Jack. So Phil walks in and she says, oh, Cracker Jack, can I have some? And Phil's like, well, don't even say hi to me, just ask for the Cracker Jack. And so he gives her the box and she opens it up and she starts eating Cracker Jack. She pulls out the little package with the ring in it.
Prize.
And she feels through the package and she goes, oh, good, a ring. That's the best thing to get on the Cracker Jack. And then she takes it and sets it down on the table. Now, Phil is there. My brother Barry is there.
They all know
another
this is
friend's
a
there.
gift.
Everyone knows that what's going on. And Margie lets us sit there for 20 minutes at least, some long period of time. Everyone's dying. And she finally picks it up and opens it up. And she looks at the ring. She gets this like quizzical look on her face. She looks at it and looks at it. And she finally turns to me and goes, "Is this the kind of ring you get in Cracker Jack?" And I looked at her and I said, "No, it's not." And then she looks again, she says, "Where did it come from?" I said, "From me." And
Cute.
so that's how we got it. And she said later, it's like, it never occurred to her that it would be from me because I had promised her that I would not get a ring without her.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So she thought, well, it can't be from Bob because she promised not to. So anyway, that's how Margie got her engagement ring.
Every time I eat
She
bread,
likes the ring.
That was in the spring of 1974, maybe, well,
yeah,
February or March, I think, I would think of 74.
married in
Did
August.
she like the ring even though
She
you
did,
went?
Oh, right.
That-
That's right.
That's good.
she did.
Especially from Cracker Jack.
Well, she said she did.
She still has it.
That's a long story. So anyway, that's, yeah,
So how many years are you married then? Are we getting close to 50, right?
we are,
That's fine.
this August will be our 47th wedding anniversary,
Guess I know you're married in
47.
74. Okay.
74. So
Yeah.
in
Whoa.
2024, we will be 50 years.
That was special.
Knock on wood. So,
So,
What
Mama,
other-
I was actually gonna go back to you for a little bit. So you have like a bunch of kids. Whatever you had, what was that kind of like with the house and having like a bunch of kids around? And I forgot how many?
10.
Did you have? 10.
Yeah.
Like, what was that kind of like having so many people around the house? And
It's wonderful. I love it. Yeah, my brother lived with us too. So it's kind of a small house. It's just 2 bedrooms.
4 bedrooms, 2 up.
Well,
2
it
down.
started out with 2, but then we finished the upstairs.
All right.
So then, put 2. So we only have 4 bedrooms. We had 10 kids, and my brother lived with us too. Actually, when I was first married, my 2 brothers lived with us. A really good husband. He just actually, when we were married, or no, when we were in an apartment, it was a 1-bedroom apartment. And we had 2 of the kids, Danny and Margie, and my 2 brothers lived with us too, plus Red and I. I never felt crowded.
And no
But
phone.
Red-
Was that where you had no phone?
Oh, no, I never had a phone. They just, yeah.
I love that story about somebody else that you call somebody else's.
Oh, well, yeah, the phone story is kind of fun. So, okay, we got married, we lived in the apartment, and then we bought the house in Niles. And my brother came to live with us, both brothers, for a while too. Oh, wait, but before that, we were in an apartment in our old neighborhood. I grew up in Rogers Park, okay? And my mother-in-law was there already, okay? So, and there's this big court in between the 2 wings of the apartment building. So she was on the 3rd floor of one side, and there's this big court. And then we were on the 2nd floor, Red and I, on the other side. Well, here I had Danny. I would put him downstairs in his buggy in the middle of that court, and he would take his naps there. I'm just saying how the times were, I didn't worry about him or anything. You never worried about him. Grandma would yell out the window, "Did he wake up yet? When's he going to wake up?" And you just trusted everybody. I would go to the store, Devon Avenue, it's a pretty big shopping center and stuff. And I could leave him outside the store. I wasn't the only person that did this. And I'd come back and people would be playing with him. He'd be like about 10 months old or something, whatever. But you just didn't worry about it. But anyway, the telephone. So we didn't get a telephone till we had at least 3 or 4 kids. And but Mom had the telephone on the 3rd floor. So she would yell out the window, when people called, and then I'd run down my 2 flights and back up her 3 flights to answer the phone. It was pretty fun.
Like, Mary Jean, you have a phone call.
Yeah, it was good exercise, but it was fun. I always really would rather visit people than call, like in the neighborhood. I was just always run around to the people's houses.
But that's so different from now everybody having a cell phone
No.
and walking around with an instant communication.
That's right.
You'd live and many people didn't even have a phone.
Right.
And you'd have to call someone else and they'd have to go get you.
And we didn't have a car, because my dad had died and stuff. And then even in our, well, Red took the car. That's the only car we had, though. I'd have to go from 8,300 north to 7,300 south to get the car for the day. It was a little trouble. You had to go all the way to the south side of Chicago.
Which is where he worked.
Right. Oh, yeah, we were in a really good business, though. His dad was president of a cookie company. So anytime you wanted cookies, people would go to wherever we were going, the people would say, well, be sure and bring some cookies with. So it's really fun. Love those cookies.
And
So you also met,
Margie worked for a Carvel ice cream store, and the people sort of, Danny and Margie and Susie and Davy
Dave
and
and
Bobby
Bobby
and
and
Jeannie
Down to Jeannie. Yeah.
all worked there. And this couple that owned it didn't have any kids of their own. And so they treated all the DeLorenzo kids like their own family.
They loved us.
And
yeah.
so they would take home lots of ice cream for free all the time.
Yeah, Jack, you know what? I would get them when they made the brown bonnets, and if it fell off, then they would send it home to me. And all these rejects were in my freezer. And about 5 or 8 years later, when they left, and I went to have my cholesterol tested, it was like 350 because of all those brown
Ice cream all
bonnets.
day, every day.
Oh my golly, that was the biggest thing. But they were so good to us. Ice cream people.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So when I was dating Margie, I'd go pick her up from her work at the Carvel store. And Pauline and Gary, who were the owners, would they were excited that Margie had a boyfriend, I guess, and they would always want to give me ice cream. And Margie's like, no, you can't take ice cream from them. You have to pay for it.
Oh,
And I'd
yeah.
be like, okay. But they'd be like, no, here, take the ice cream. And Margie's like, no. So,
When-
so I think maybe she didn't want to feel beholding,
Maybe.
about me. So
They would always have us come early and go in the little back room because all sorts of ice cream and treats. Yeah.
So
Especially fun
when
years.
did
Wait, when-
you what?
Oh, I was just I didn't get to say when Bob was telling all the stories about all the wars and stuff,
Uh-huh.
and
What-
everything that
what's
was
that?
going on. I didn't even pay any attention hardly. I didn't know anybody in the war and stuff. It's just so different. Bob
You
knows
just-
every detail, and I couldn't have told you anything about
because
it.
I was this close to having to be in the war.
Right, and I was
Yeah,
supposed to
right.
have it all my babies, so I didn't.
So,
But I could have paid more attention.
but you remember
Yeah.
Pearl Harbor, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But you were 10 years old then.
Right. Yeah. Sunday, December 7th. It's like one of those days you never forget what you were doing. We just got home from church, out playing, and all of a sudden, it's
Right.
not so good.
And I was a similar age. I was a little older because I was 12, I think. I was 12, 11 when Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, yeah. I remember
So-
that perfectly.
So I was in 6th grade when that happened. So I do remember that.
Oh, I had just had Barbie. And I remember I was nursing Barbie and watching TV, and all of a sudden they said we have something, no an alert and everything, and it was really bad.
Yeah.
But never forget that.
November 22nd, 1963. These are dates that all these kind of dates, and April 4th, 1968, that was Martin Luther King. And,
Like what Roosevelt said, a day that will live in infamy. He made a speech right away
yeah.
when we started World War II. first.
Yep.
But I interrupted you, Jacqueline.
Or I was gonna ask when, so like when Bob was like dating Margie, like when did you guys first meet each other and stuff? Like was that like did Margie?
Well, I said
Like,
at the prom when I was,
No, like when did you meet Mama?
oh, Mama. Well,
Oh, remember the first time he was over with Barry.
my brother, my younger brother.
And first I know they're climbing, chasing each other up the basketball pole. I don't know how two people, these wild kids were out there, and here it was Bob. And
We
Very-
rode our bicycles
So-
over to the house.
Hmm.
We only, my parents' house was only about 2.5 miles from Mama's house. So we had ridden over there, and we were goofing around a lot.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad, but it was
so-
funny.
We were not, it's not like we were angry or anything. We were just
No, you
a
were just
little
good.
wild, yeah.
Mm.
Um,
Turned out to be very calm and wonderful. That was kind of exciting.
So yeah, that's, and I'm not sure when that would have
That's what I was
been.
trying to think.
It's
How long?
probably in the fall of 71. I would have been back from college for the weekend maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And Barry was still in high school, and we were like, so I wanted to go see Margie, who was like, you know, the girl I was, you know, interested in. And so we rode our bikes over there.
Yeah, that was it.
Um,
Then
yeah.
we got to see you a lot.
My parents had cars, but I didn't have a car at that
At
point.
school.
No,
How do you get back and forth then? Did
the
they
train,
come-
South Shore train.
Oh,
We
yeah,
take the
the
train
train.
back and
That's
forth to
it.
school. Although my junior year of college, my brother Barry's freshman year of college, he came to Notre Dame as well. We decided to buy a car together, so we wouldn't have to take the train all the time. And we tried to buy a car and tried to buy a car. We didn't have much money. We were buying it ourselves, and my dad had a friend that owned a garage. And so we'd look at a car and say, well, maybe we'll get this car. And my dad would ask the guy at the garage, should they buy that car? And he'd say, oh, don't buy that car. That's a death trap. You know, and it's like, so everything we were thinking about buying was getting nixed, right? So my dad finally comes home one day and says, look, I talked to the guy. He says, it's just he, his wife, and a daughter. And he says, he owns 5 cars.
Oh.
He said he'd sell me one of his cars. We were like, well, I don't
Perfect.
know. What's it gonna, well, I don't know what's it
Mhm.
gonna be, you know, some really old junker, you know,
Old-fashioned.
old fashioned car, you know, what it's gonna be. And we said to my dad, so well, what cars are they? And he says, well, I don't know. I didn't ask him. So my dad calls him up and he says, well, and he hangs up from the guy, says, well, he says, it's 1 or 2 cars he's gonna sell us. He says, it's either gonna sell us the GTO or the Shelby. Now, these are the 2 biggest muscle cars
Oh, no.
in the country with these huge engines, you know, that these cars could go, you know, 150 miles an hour. So we were like, oh my gosh, and he's going to sell them to us like for nothing.
What does
Um,
Chet think?
Well, this guy said these are good cars. So, and he did not know, but my brother and I were like laughing, like, we can't believe this. We're getting either a GTO or a Shelby. So the guy finally sold the GTO. So here's my story with this. I learned how to drive a stick shift. These are stick shift cars. And I learned how to drive a stick shift on a Volkswagen Beetle.
Right.
And so I know how to do it. Is you put the clutch in, you put it in gear, you take your foot off the clutch, you hit the gas, you know, and down you go. I did not realize that when you had a muscle car like this, you had to feather the clutch very gently.
Mm.
So we go and buy the car, and I get behind the wheel. My brother Barry does not know how to drive a stick shift yet. I put the car in reverse, back out of the driveway into the street.
Reverse is more gentle.
Well, yeah, no problem. I put the car in first gear, and I take my foot off the clutch, and I'm laying rubber down the street. The tires are squealing. You know, and off we go. Like, oh. Dad is like slack jaw, going, oh my gosh, you know,
Wow.
it's like, oops.
We just had to do it more gradually.
So, I
because
mean,
that's the way-
every time we left anywhere in the car, he'd come out and say, you know, it's a pretty hot car. Be careful.
It takes a lot of gas and you have to get the more expensive gas for them.
No, we didn't. Gas
Isn't
at
that
that
bad?
time, I can tell you how
That was a big difference.
we would
gas.
buy gas. It was 18 cents a gallon in South Bend. It was 25 cents a
I
gallon in
was gonna say,
Chicago.
I thought it was a quarter.
Quarter. It
but
was a
yours
quarter in
is-
Chicago. It
oh,
was
okay.
18 cents in South Bend.
Okay.
We look for loose change. Like 350 would fill the tank with gas, $3.50.
Mhm.
You know, and if we ever had people that we'd give a ride home to, they, you know, each give us $1 or something and would pay for gas, a tank of gas.
That was no problem.
So it was no problem because yes, it didn't get great gas mileage, but you always got to where you were going very quickly.
Oh, that's pretty fun. Bob.
So from the
Stop
parking
wondering.
lot at Notre Dame to my parents' driveway was 105 miles.
Oh.
All right, exactly.
So
Our
now-
best time from school to home was 1 hour and 5 minutes.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Terrible.
That's terrible. I'm saying this, but it was like
Ooh, that put you in
this car,
jail.
it's such a big engine. If you weren't paying attention, you were going 90
Yeah.
miles an hour. It would just,
Take off, right?
it had this, what was called a Hurst 4-speed transmission. The gear ratio was such that when you had it up in 4th gear,
Oh,
you were going 90 miles an hour without barely touching the gas. You were going 90 miles an hour. And if you,
why did he sell that to a kid? That doesn't sound good.
we never had any trouble. We're never in an accident. We never,
Good, okay.
I never got a ticket. Barry got some tickets. At one point, he had a girlfriend who was going to school in Ohio. We were going to school in Indiana, right, at Notre Dame. We lived in Illinois.
Mhm.
At one point, Barry had a ticket in Illinois, a ticket in Indiana, and a ticket from,
That's pretty good.
so he had 3 tickets. But you know, in those days, I mean, nowadays, every state's got communicates with every other state, and you know, there's databases and all this stuff. There was nothing like that back then. So a ticket in Ohio had people in Ohio had no idea unless they were calling up and trying to get a paper trail, you know, specifically asking, which they wouldn't do on a routine traffic stop. But that's the only way that, you know, any state would know. But he had those 3 tickets. Now he did not tell his parents that he had these tickets. You know, 2 tickets in any state, you were at risk of 2 speeding tickets in a state, you were at risk of losing your license.
Oh, yeah.
But he had 3, but each from a different state, so he was okay.
That's fine.
So, yeah, so, you know, so we had that. And when I graduated college, and Barry was an architecture student, and your 3rd year of the architecture program, you went and spent a year in Rome, Italy, studying architecture. And so I was getting married and going to graduate school. He was going off to Europe. I didn't have the money to buy him out with the car. I dropped all sorts of hints to my dad about maybe he could, you know, about, gee, I can't really afford to buy out Barry's half of the
Yeah.
car and
Little
all this
wedding
stuff.
present, maybe.
Well, you know, so he never said anything. So we ended up selling the car.
Oh,
Oh,
And about a month later, he goes, you know, I probably should have just bought that Barry out for you and given you the car. I was like,
oh, no.
too late now. By then,
Surprised Bernice
we
didn't think of that.
sent it to, we sold the car to a neighbor who bought it for his son.
Oh, no.
And within a month of having the car, he totaled it.
Yeah.
oh,
You should've-
Luckily, he was not
Did you warn
badly
them?
injured.
I
Well,
hope you warned them.
I don't know. The son was kind of a goof.
Mm.
Anyway, Barry and I were pretty
So
responsible.
then where'd you get a car? Did you ever get a car then?
After that,
Yeah.
well, we bought a secondhand Volkswagen Beetle that we drove around for a
Oh,
little
the Beetle.
while. And
Used to
then,
use the erasers, that one, to clean the
yeah,
windows.
yeah, didn't have any defroster, so it's just
Really?
the inside of the windshield would steam
Wasn't-
up. We had an eraser and you would,
Did it even have heat? I think it was really cold.
no, it didn't
too.
have, it didn't have heat.
Didn't even have heat going around. Ooh, it was very bad.
It was close. So when we were having kids, started having kids, we ended up buying a car. My grandfather offered me a loan to buy a new car. And so we bought a Toyota Celica.
That's when I remember it.
And this is when Toyotas and foreign cars like this were like the weirdest thing in the world. Nobody had these things. And there was no Toyota dealership in the Chicago area.
Oh,
We ended up having to go to Rockford, Illinois
wow, that's really going
to
back.
get the car because it was just weird, you know. I
How
mean,
long did you have that? That was my favorite.
we liked the car. We had it for a few years. We had it until Michael was born because you couldn't put 3 kids in the back of a Celica.
Oh,
We had it through David and Carrie. We drove it out to, when I was in graduate, I went to graduate school and I did an internship in Portland, Oregon. We drove the Celica out there. And we drove it back. Here's an interesting story. Pauline and Gary, the ice cream people, had retired, and we were retired in Phoenix, Arizona. So on our way back, we did a kind of a tour, and we drove down the West Coast and went to Phoenix and visited with them. And they took us to a cabin they had. I don't know if it was theirs or somebody they knew, in the mountains in northern Arizona.
all right.
And
Porcupines.
our last night there, I mean, the morning we get up to go leave, pack in the car, I go out to turn on the car and it won't start.
Yeah, I remember
And we're
this
out in the middle of
story.
nowhere in the woods in rural Arizona.
No cell phone.
No cell phones. So luckily, we were up in the mountains and the closest town was all downhill.
Oh, no.
I kid you not. So
So you don't have any gas and you did it?
we
That's
couldn't, the
pretty
car
good.
wouldn't run. So you couldn't, gas didn't do you any
Wow.
good.
Yeah.
Got, Gary pushed us with his car out onto the road. And then we went downhill about 5
boy.
miles, I think,
Wow.
maybe more, to the town where there was a gas station, right? And we pull into the gas station and there's all, you know, in those days, all gas stations had mechanics.
That was good.
I mean, you didn't, gas stations always, you know, had mechanics with them. That was the standard thing. So I pull in and I go, I say to the guy, I got a problem. It's like my car won't start. And he goes, well, I've never seen one of these before.
Oh,
There's a Toyota Celica. It was a foreign car. He had no idea how it worked or anything
Oh,
about
I
it. Never
see.
seen one. So he's like,
That's trouble.
we opened the hood and he's like, well, let's just try and figure it out going through. And he like, you know, he does this, he does that. There's the other thing, goes, you know, trying to look through the electrical system or all these different
Yeah.
things. He finally goes, well, wait a minute. It could be a fuse. So there's an electronic, I think there's an it looks like there's an electronic fuel pump on this car.
It's not
And he
used
goes
to
into
that.
into the panel, the electrical panel in the car, and the fuse had blown. He goes, well, I don't have any fuses like this. Do you have any fuses? I'm like, I don't know. I look in the glove compartment. The car had come with a little package of like extra fuses.
Wow.
Oh.
And it had one of the ones, and we
Oh
plugged
my
it in,
God.
and the car worked, and off we went.
Oh, Bob. Lucky.
Yeah, I was really lucky, but it was like, it was like, Celica, Toyota, I don't know how these things work. It's like, that's a Japanese car. We've never seen one of those. He had never seen one before.
It's a good experience.
So that's like a different world, right? Foreign cars were like,
That's right.
they were not around. They were exotic, really exotic.
Yeah.
And
I thought they kind of took over right after the war. No,
not
no.
foreign cars. Well,
Japan-
right
Japanese.
after the Vietnam War, not
No.
World War II.
But we really did build up Japan after the war. All our stuff was old and everything, and Japan was building all of the new things.
But
And they
we were-
did go big for cars. too.
We imported to the entire world after World War II, because every place else was decimated, and anything they
Yeah,
needed,
I
they had
mean,
to get
for a
from the
couple of
United
years,
States.
but Japan did come back quickly, very quickly. And they were better than ever.
So I don't know. Those are my young years there, Jack.
Mhm.
There's
Right.
probably a lot of other stories. I don't know.
I was thinking of cars for us. We never really had a car much, right? And if we did, it was a station wagon. But in those days, I would have the little one in a little bed in between the seats in the back. And then there was a little thing you'd attached to the back seat, I guess. This is really dangerous, I think, with a little steering wheel. So Danny had his own little driving seat right next to me. I mean, we didn't realize at the time, but
front
now
together.
they were not very sturdy at all. And
Yeah.
then we had a station wagon. So in the back, you could put 5. We'd even bring the neighbors' kids. I remember once we had about at least 10 kids in the back when we went out to this farm. It's really pretty wild, but
So I remember the DeLorenzo cars when I first was dating Margie. They always had stick shifts,
Right.
3-speed on the column was called. So you had on the gear shift on the column, you go first and second and third and reverse. And the car they had when I first started dating Margie, the shifter had broken off,
Uh-oh.
and they had a clamp wrench. It was clamped onto the end of the
I didn't
stub
remember
of
this.
the shifter, and you had to grab onto the wrench that was grabbing onto the shift stick,
Ah.
and
are you sure? Well,
And-
that's something.
and drive the car with that shifter. It was, and I'm thinking, this is a little weird. Oh no, I remember that because it was so different.
Uh-huh.
I would say one other thing. You make me think of this. It's like, I remember I grew up in the aftermath of World War II, right?
Mhm.
And before the war was the Depression for many years, right? From 29 on through till 41. So for 12 years. the
Really,
Depression-
I didn't even know we were poor if there was a depression.
Well, a lot of people were poor, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And then the war comes along. So there were a lot of buildings and things there wasn't a lot of building and new things going on.
But the 20s was the big
The 20s,
building.
right, big building. But
That's
nothing
what
was built
20s.
between the 20s and the mid 40s.
Yeah.
And I remember as a kid, there'd be all these things that'd be like these old time places, things that were built, in the 19 teens or 1900 or 1920s.
Mhm.
And like gas stations would be like these old little
Really?
things that
Never
like,
got to a gas station.
that would be from like, I'd see all these things that looked, I knew that they weren't like these modern things of the 1950s, right? When I was a kid.
Mhm.
They were things from a long time ago, and they were everywhere. And I remember growing up and watching them like one by one disappear. And I thought how weird that was, because the things from way back then were always on a
true.
scale and looked like, small town, old time, homey kind of places, right?
Mhm.
Dilapidated
I
also.
never thought of that. We didn't start building till the 50s.
Right, we didn't start
Yeah.
building anything till the 50s. And then, you'd go, and there were all these things like, I still, and I know you had this when you were a kid, Mom, but it was still there. We lived in our house, we were about a mile from the little business district. We're in Chicago on the northwest side, but we were about a mile from like a little
Devon Avenue. Are you
Devon
talking about-
Avenue, right, and businesses. And right on the corner, I could ride through the neighborhood and not have to cross any busy street. And right on the corner, right when you got to what was Devon and Lehigh, there was a drugstore. And it was a drugstore that still had a soda fountain. There was a counter and seats, and you'd order like
Did anything- That's where Red worked at the soda fountain.
or,
Actually, did you know
like
that?
a root beer float, or or something.
Well,
And
Darby
they'd
said
have the little,
Cherry Cokes.
yeah. Well, they'd have a big lever and a little handle that would put the, carbonated water in, and they'd put flavors in the carbonated water, and they'd, make a soft drink for you, or
It's kind of like It's a Wonderful Life. Remember, did you ever see that?
Mhm.
Yeah,
where
there-
Jim Stewart's behind the counter. Well,
yeah, Pops used to make all those.
So- so we would go there and get our, the drink there. And you could buy candy there and other things. So this
right.
was like a big deal. We'd ride our bikes there and get a soda, from the counter. And it's like, and I knew when I was getting it, it was like, this was just like the old movies,
Mhm.
There were, it's kind of interesting. Oh, within 1 block of each other, a block and a half, in our little business section, there were 3 pharmacies, 3 drugstores.
Oh,
Ours was out right there. Then you'd have to cross over Lehigh and railroad tracks, and right on the other side of the tracks there was a second drugstore. And you go down to the corner to where the big ice cream shop was. There's a big ice cream shop there called the Lockwood Castle, and you go past that about a half a block, and then there was another drugstore. And each one was a little different, and only the one still had the soda fountain.
oh, right,
it.
because they did
one-
get rid of those.
The one right across the tracks used to have one, you could tell, but it was like now just a counter, and it wasn't, they didn't have machines. And the one farther down was like a modern 50s kind of, nothing like that. It was just a, dispensing,
Right.
medicines kind of place.
That was a big thing when I was little, because candy, of course, was big, but a penny would go a long way. My mom would send me with 21 cents to get 2 loaves of bread plus a penny for tax. So I'd always bring a friend with, and then she could buy 1 loaf and I could buy the other one, so we didn't have to pay any tax then. And then we'd have a penny. And
That's neat.
my little neighbor, they owned a nice little grocery store, and they had the penny candy thing was just huge. You could pick out anything. They had cigars, they had nuts, and you could get like about 8 little things for a penny. It's really the best.
Now what you're saying reminds me of something I remember from being young. We'd go to my dad's parents, my grandparents' house, and they lived in the city of Chicago also, and in a older neighborhood.
Oh yeah.
And just out their back gate, down the alley, a house or two, and there was like a little store,
Oh, yeah.
storefront. I think it was the meat store, the butcher shop.
Oh,
And my grandmother would send us to the butcher shop to get
neat.
meat. And we'd go there, and then she would have ordered the meat, and we would go there as like these little kids. I mean, I'd be like, 7 years old, 8 years old. And we walk into the butcher shop and we'd say,
I would always
meat.
get 1 pound of chopped meat. That's all I ever got.
but we'd order something. And then we were to tell the guy to just put it on account.
Yeah.
You wouldn't pay for it there. They knew, so that they would know who we were, that we were my grandparents'
Exactly.
kids, because we'd gone in there with them, right? And we could just go there and say, well, I need 2 pounds of hamburger, put it on account. And they'd say, okay, and they just write down that, that my grandmother owed them for 2 pounds of hamburger, right? And that's a carryover from the Depression, when people couldn't always pay
Mhm.
when they needed food. So stores would let people put things on account all the time. And this is before credit cards. Credit cards
course.
did not exist back then. And so people could put things on the account from the store and buy it. But so I remember that it was like, there's also a candy store across Belmont, just a few steps farther along, was called the Sugar Bowl, which was a candy
Yeah.
place. My grandfather used to take us there to get candy. That was an
Yes.
exciting thing. My grandfather was a barber, and right around the corner, right on Belmont,
Is that where shop was?
he had a shop,
Mm.
Bill's Barber Shop.
Mm.
And so we'd go there and visit my grandparents, and he'd cut our hair.
That was fun.
So, yeah, fun playing in the chairs, and we'd play in the barber chairs in the shop, and we could go in the back room. There was a back room where you could, where he would go, where the customers couldn't go. And
Right. We're privileged, just like us in the ice cream place,
yeah, I
right?
do remember once we got our haircut, and then we got up and walked out, and a guy sitting there goes, "Those kids didn't pay. They didn't pay."
Yeah.
My grandfather said, "Oh, they're my grandkids."
So I'll talk about the butcher shop. Brought back the memory that I used to get 25 cents of this ground beef, but on the way home, I would eat out part of it. The raw hamburger is really good. When the butcher shop had the sawdust floor and everything, they did all the stuff right at that place. You had all the animals hanging up, so you knew the meat was good. So on the way home,
They were just freshly ground, right?
yeah, so it
Not
was so
prepa-
good on the way home.
Nothing prepackaged there.
It
And-
was
And I
kinda
remember this
bad.
also with my grandmother's place. There were all the food there, and she'd get like rabbits there. They have rabbits,
Oh,
and she'd make Hassenpfeffer, which is just cooked rabbit. And that was
that sounds good.
so.
It's dark meat, right?
Yeah, it's like a dark meat of chicken kind of thing. It was, that kind of dark meat.
Here. It's just looking at, I made little notes of one more thing I could tell you about our local park. When I grew up, we just spent the whole day at the park, and the parks were free. Everything they had dancing, ballet, toe dancing, gymnastics, just all kinds of wonder. And then we had a pond there so that we'd freeze and you could go ice skating there. And it also had 6 tennis courts, I think, at this park. So they would have a lot of the big tennis playoff things there. So that was pretty neat. But that was one of my big things
know,
for all summer.
And you talked about how you'd leave the kids in the carriage
Yeah.
outside the store. When I was a kid, in the summers in particular, because you weren't in school, in the morning, my parents would say, "Don't be hanging around the house. It's summer. Go outside and play." So we were told to get out of the house and go play someplace. Now, the rule was we couldn't leave the neighborhood, right?
Right.
But we would go play. So we'd go call on our friends, or we'd ride our bikes to our friend's house, or ride a bike to the park.
Mhm.
And typically we'd ride our bike, in the summer, we'd ride our bike to the park and see what kids were there. I mean, this is the baby boomer years, right? There were kids,
There's always
there were
people.
kids everywhere. So I could ride to the park and there'd be, 10, 15 kids there waiting to play, organizing a pickup game of baseball. And we would play what we called lob league, slow pitch. You just had to throw the pitch in there and let people hit it. And we would play that at the park all morning. We had to be home at 12 for lunch. So we'd ride our bikes home by 12. We'd eat lunch, we'd go back to the park. We'd play baseball all afternoon. We had to be home at 5 for dinner. And then after dinner in the summer, there'd be Little League. So like at 6:30 or something, there'd be 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I think it was, there'd be a Little League baseball game. So I played baseball in the morning, baseball in the afternoon, baseball in the evening. And that was every day in the summer, unless it was so hot that we'd go to the swimming pool, the Park District swimming pool. And then there'd be hundreds, maybe thousands of kids in the pool. You couldn't swim anywhere. You could stand in the water and there'd be kids everywhere.
But you had the coldest water in the world. He'd take
No.
us to this pool.
No, that was Norwood Park pool
Yeah.
when our kids were little. But
It was warmer.
Wayland Pool's where I would go as a
Oh,
kid.
right. I couldn't go there. It was too far. And I think you had to pay to go there, actually. That was close to where I lived, Wayland Pool.
Wayland Pool is on Devon and
Right.
Milwaukee.
I know. My brothers went, but I couldn't go. I know it wasn't that close.
Not close to
but
Rogers
it
Park.
was considered one of the best ones
About
to
8
go
miles
to.
from Rogers Park. Yeah. But yeah, so we would do that. And you had to pay.
Yeah. that's
Can't
why
remember
we
what it
didn't go
was. It
there
was
ever.
not, I mean, it was a little bit, but you had to pay to go in. And what I recall was you didn't wear your own bathing suit.
Oh,
You'd go in and they would give you a bathing suit. And they were all the same, you know, they were
Mhm.
all one because they didn't trust you.
mm,
You literally you had to go in, you had to take, you had to bathe, you had to shower, you take a shower,
yeah.
you know, wash yourself naked. And then they give you this like white trunks
Oh my
that you
golly.
put on,
I'm
and then
glad I never did get
and
that.
then you could
Sounds
go
like
into the
trouble.
pool. I don't know what it was like on the girls' side. They didn't
Yeah.
have a sister. But that's what you did. And you wore that. And when you got done, you know, I mean, you put your clothes in a locker, right?
Mhm.
And then you came back out and there was a bin that you threw the trunks in.
So what was so good about that pool? That's,
It was big.
oh, okay.
It was a big pool.
Oh, it was like by the toboggan
Yeah,
side.
it was like
That's right,
an
the
Olympic
big
size
toboggan stuff, yeah.
pool. It was big. So it was you know,
But I should tell you about Pops. When Pops would get up in the morning, he would leave by 5 o'clock or earlier. Mom wouldn't see him till late at night. And once she was listening to the radio, and this kid had saved somebody's life out in Lake Michigan. And sure enough, it was Red. The kid was trying to swim out to something where some other people were, and Red swam out and got him and saved his
and it was
life.
on the radio. They heard the story on the radio, not knowing that it was Red, that it was actually the person that saved the kid's life.
Because he'd be gone all day. First, he'd steal all the good stuff out of the refrigerator. His mom would take her. But anyway, it was a good story.
So, I mean, I think when we were kids, when you were kids, even when I was a kid, you were pretty much left more on your own.
Oh, completely. We would play detective. We would follow drunks and different people to the bar and stuff. Wasn't that cool? Just for excitement. We'd listen to these. Oh, the big thing was the radio, though, Jack. All you do is listen to the radio and tell the TV at night. The radio, because the ball games on the radio were almost more exciting than going to the game. But that
Well-
was, so we'd have these mystery programs we'd listen to, and they were always following weird people. So we did that.
I
too.
think what I remember is when I was a little kid, we didn't have a TV.
No, we didn't either.
And I remember when my parents bought it and it came home and we had a TV, and it was, in those days, only black and white TVs, and the picture tube was round.
Yeah, wait.
And it was in a kind of squared box, but there was like a little molding around it. But
Uh-huh.
the picture itself was pretty much round, maybe not perfectly round, but it's close to round. And the quality of the picture was very bad. And then I remember
we didn't have a TV though, because I had it for Danny. We were pretty poor.
but
about
I remember
50s
being a
by
little kid. I remember
54.
it coming home and I remember it being delivered.
Okay,
so I
probably
must have-
about 2 years old.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
about 2 or 3
that's
years
about when
old. I
we
was
got
pretty
ours.
little.
Okay.
And then later on, late 50s, we got and it was like in a cabinet, right?
Oh, right.
And then later on, we got a TV that was a portable TV. It came on a stand, and we could wheel it from room to room, and we would literally wheel it around the house, and from the living room to the we had a porch where we ate
Right.
our meals, and we'd wheel it back and forth from one to the other. And occasionally, if you were sick, they'd take the TV and they'd walk it upstairs to your bedroom, and you could lay in bed and watch TV when you were sick.
Uh-oh.
And then everyone would come up and watch TV with you. So you didn't go downstairs and watch TV.
Well, it was only this big, Jack. It was like 12 inches.
They were not really large, yeah.
And that was the diagonal was 12 inches. That was always tricky.
So so I remember that, and I remember the first time I saw a color TV. It was 1959,
Yeah, that seems early, really.
and
Which is
we were
ours.
out to eat at a restaurant. I remember the name of the restaurant, DeLeo's Restaurant
Ooh,
at Central and Elston. My parents used to like going there,
right.
and
That
we
was
were at this,
We had a shower there.
and we were there, and we're out to dinner, and and maybe I'm confabulating things and not remembering it right, but they had a bar area, and in the bar area, they had a TV, so people that were sitting at the bar could watch
Right.
TV, and there was a baseball game on. and it was a color TV, and the grass was green
Uh-oh.
on the TV.
Yeah.
It was actually color. And I was mesmerized by this. It was like I'd never seen such a thing. You know, I mean, and the colors are pretty much like green and red and not much else. You know, it's like at least there was color. But and I watched, and I remember seeing that. And we went and sat down, and like I excused myself to go to the bathroom 2 or 3 times, and I would stop on the way between
Closer to it.
to look at the TV and watch some of the baseball game because it was in color.
Right.
Because
You knew there were colored TVs though, but just didn't see
well, I don't
them.
know. I'd never seen. I
But
mean,
you
I probably
didn't-
did. I probably knew that there were. I don't
Yeah,
remember. It was the
just-
first time I saw such a thing, and I was amazed. And I was like, "Oh man, I can't wait to get a color TV." Now, my parents didn't get one for another like probably 5 or 10 years
Yeah.
because they were ridiculously expensive. You know, they finally came down in price. But yeah, so I mean, I don't remember when we got a color TV. I was pretty old. I mean, it might have been when I was in high school that we got a color TV.
Mm.
I know by the time I graduated high school, we had one.
But now black and white is kind of exciting. Like it.
Well, you know,
But
they had to develop the
Mm.
cameras to broadcast things in color before you could show things in color, right? And you had to have color TV and the color cameras and everything else.
yeah.
And of course, so I grew up on black and white stuff on
Mhm.
TV and black and white movies. And for years and years, I watched The Wizard of Oz. I don't know if you know this
Like the
movie. It
Rabbit
starts
Hotel.
out. It starts out in Kansas, and they actually filmed those scenes in black and white because it was supposed to be this like, you know, gray skies and a gray field and a gray. In the
On the
book, it talks
farm.
about how there's no color in the farms in
Mhm.
Kansas, right? And so it starts out filmed in black and white, and then when Dorothy opens the door from her house that is dropped in the land of Oz, right? She opens the door and
Mhm.
everything is, you see, it opens
Colors.
to all this color, and the rest of the movie
It's really overwhelming. That was
is
one of
in
the first,
overwhelming
right?
color. Well, that was, yeah,
Really.
from 1939, yeah, in the movies. And, but I'd only watch that movie at home on a black and white TV.
Mhm.
I did not know,
Wait, did that come out in 39?
yeah,
That colored TV?
no color
But how did
movies.
they get it? How did they get the colored films like that?
They had color film for movies,
Oh.
but they didn't have color television broadcasting. It's a whole different
Oh.
technology.
Because that was pretty unusual.
So I watched it on TV for many years growing up, and I had no idea that it switched to color
Mhm.
because I had only ever
Oh,
seen it in
okay.
black and white.
Mhm.
So many movies still through the 1950s, they still made a lot of movies in black and white because color movies were expensive to make. So you had to have a big budget film to go color. It was really in the 1960s that film started the technology became, improved and cheap enough that everything was in color from that point on. And I remember, so I grew up with the black and white TVs and black and white movies and all that stuff. And nowadays, I remember I talk to people and they go, I mentioned a movie and they go, "Oh, that's a black and white one, is it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it is." And they go, "I don't like to watch black." But that does, it's like they can't. The thought of watching a black and white movie is like, it's so weird. It's so artificial. Why would anyone watch that? And I'm like, it's a whole different world. Yeah, but it's like the world I grew up in.
That's right.
That everything was in black and white.
All the TV stuff.
Yeah.
Color.
Yeah.
Like
So-
movies, we used to, every Sunday we go to the movie and there were always double features. And then the movies would change in the middle of the week. You'd start out with one movie and then they'd have 2 new movies in the middle of the week. It was pretty good.
Right. And you're talking, and these are days before television was actually in people's homes.
Mm.
So you wanted to see movies and things, you went to the theater.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, even when televisions came, there was only what was broadcast. So
Right.
you couldn't watch anything unless it was scheduled to be broadcast, right?
Mhm.
So every Sunday in the paper, there'd be a TV section where they'd list all the TV shows for the whole week. And it would be something you sit down on Sunday and you'd page through it to listen and see all the movies.
Mhm.
You know, if there was going to be a movie you wanted to see.
Right.
You
because
know,
we
and-
did not have DVRs.
And so, and there was no way to record it or anything else. So, I mean, I remember seeing, there'd be movies, oh, I wanted to see that movie. I've never seen it. It'd be on at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know,
So did you used to get up sometimes?
I
and
would
watch?
sneak up sometimes and go down and watch the movie. And my parents would wake up, I'd be in trouble. But, you know, you had to watch it when it was on. There was no way to record it. And if you missed it, you missed it. And then it might not be on television again for
Another
2,
couple
3, 5,
years.
10, 5 years.
Yep.
And if you want to see that movie again, if you like that movie, it's like, how are you ever going to see it again? You know, it's like,
Except Wizard of Oz was on every year.
there'd be certain movies that they would show every year at a certain time, very popular ones. But there were so many others that that you'd wait and wait and wait and wait to see. I remember there was one movie I'd wait and wait to see, and then it'd be scheduled to be on, and then it would get preempted for some reason,
Yeah.
or wasn't being shown. I'd be like, I waited, years to see this, and now it's supposed to be on, and it's not on. And so that would kind of happen and be very frustrating, but it was like, it was so it was, nowadays, of course you could just watch any movie anytime, right?
Mhm.
You might have to pay a couple of bucks to watch it, but you can see any movie anytime you want.
Mhm.
But
Okay.
back then it was, it was at the mercy of the TV and what I always thought were the best movies were not necessarily the most popular, so they wouldn't be broadcast very often
First years.
or at odd times. My brother Barry and I used to, when we were in high school and into college, we used to often make a pact, especially on a Saturday night. There used to be this on Saturday nights on NBC Network. They would have a midnight movie on Saturday night. It was called Midnight Movie 5 because it was Channel 5 was NBC. And we would, if there was a movie we wanted to watch, we would agree that we were gonna, whatever our date was or whatever we were doing, we'd be home before midnight. And the two of us would watch the movie together at midnight.
That's true.
To watch the movie.
Mhm.
But yeah, you had to plan your life around when it was there to
Mhm.
see. So I did end dates early, and to get
Just
home
get
to watch the movie with my brother.
Yes.
So anyway.
Check just any more questions.
Yeah, any more questions? Russ? We're going on. You got us going on and on and on about things. The more we talk, the more we remember, which is good because it probably means we don't have Alzheimer's yet.
Yeah,
So,
that's
I don't have any more questions. So thank you guys for doing this and with this project.
It was fun. I enjoyed
Telling
it.
all your story. Yeah.
you're a great host.
Thanks for doing it, and thank you,
Uh-huh.
teacher, for doing it.
Mhm.
It's kind of fun to think about these things. There were other things. I mean, all sorts we didn't even talk about. I was going to mention. Let me mention this before we go. Back when all that war stuff was going with Vietnam and the peace movement and the civil rights movement, all the music of that era was all about what was happening to us. Whether it was folk music by Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell or Joan Baez or rock and roll music.
That's why we stuck with Frank Sinatra.
Rock and roll music. Crosby, Stills and Nash were big on doing this, and other people were. The music was like speaking to what was going on. And I think you're aware of this. And there was a song about the war by Country Joe and the Fish.
Yeah.
Your mom was telling me that you knew this.
I
I think I'm gonna die, rag.
Yeah, I did something about that like a year or two.
Something like that. And there was a song that came up right after Kent State. Crosby, Stills and Nash wrote a song called "Four Dead in Ohio,"
Mm.
which was about what happened to Kent
Yeah.
State. And it was kind of a, an anthem. People would listen to that and think about.
Now that's different from us. During the Second World War, it was all uplifting songs. So my
Right.
favorite songs that I play are the good songs, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, There'll Be Bluebirds Over. They're all really pretty songs, I think.
Right.
But we had Frank Sinatra. We didn't have all those old.
But during World War II, you did not have U.S. troops shooting students on campuses in
that's
the United
true.
States.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
You were
it's just
shooting the enemy in across the
like-
globe,
good
you know?
point. Yeah.
So it was a different world, and it was internal conflict back when
Yeah.
I was doing it versus
Yeah,
know, that
can't really
foreign
write
enemy.
a happy song about that. That's for
they
sure.
can't write a happy song about
Yeah.
Shooting.
Americans killing
Yeah,
Americans.
Yeah.
But because when I was thinking about this, I started thinking about some of those songs, and I listened to some of those songs again, and I had an emotional reaction to listening to some of these, songs that were about the war and about the protest movement and about civil rights, and it was like,
Back memories, right?
well, they brought back not just cognitive memories, but they brought back emotional memories.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't have done that without having this little project,
Yeah.
So
Okay, so when we gonna
That's
get
cool.
to see you, Jack? We're all finished?
Yeah.
Oh, are we still on?
we're still on. We're still
Oh, I
recording.
thought you said
We're
we
still,
all
we're still
finished.
recording. We can see